Imagine two men, one with a toothbrush mustache, one with a face like a concrete wall, sitting at a table in Moscow at 2 in the morning, carving up an entire continent the way you'd split a pizza. No war yet, no bombs, just ink, paper, and the quiet scratch of a pen deciding that millions of people would either die, be enslaved, or simply cease to exist as citizens of their own nations. One signature, one night, 50 million corpses to follow. This is not a metaphor. This is exactly what happened on August 23, 1939, and the world would not learn the full truth of it for another 50 years. But to understand that night, you have to go back, way back. Because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact didn't come from nowhere. It was the final, grotesque punchline of a joke that Europe had been telling itself since 1919. A joke built on arrogance, cowardice, and the breathtaking human ability to ignore catastrophe until it is sitting directly on your doorstep with a gun. It begins in a railway carriage outside Compiègne, France, November 11th, 1918. The guns fall silent across the Western Front after 4 years of industrial slaughter that killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. The war to end all wars is over. The victors, Britain, France, the United States, Italy, gather in Paris to write the peace that will make sure nothing like this ever happens again. What they produce instead is arguably the single most catastrophically counterproductive document in the history of modern diplomacy. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was designed to permanently cripple Germany. It succeeded. It just crippled it in entirely the wrong way. The terms were staggering in their severity. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231, a historical judgment that was, at best, deeply contested even at the time. On the back of this admission of guilt, Germany was hit with reparations that, in today's money, would amount to somewhere around $400 billion. Its military was gutted. The army capped at 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, no tanks. Entire territories were stripped away. Alsace-Lorraine back to France, the Polish corridor carved out of German land to give the newly resurrected Poland access to the sea. The city of Danzig made a free city under League of Nations oversight. Germany lost roughly 13% of its territory and 10% of its population overnight. And then, it was told to pay for the privilege. What the Allied statesmen either did not understand or chose to ignore is that you cannot humiliate 70 million people and expect them to quietly accept it. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the Paris Peace Conference as part of the British delegation, resigned in protest and published a devastating critique called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He predicted, with almost prophetic accuracy, that the reparations regime would cause economic collapse, political radicalization, and ultimately another war. He was ignored. The celebrations continued. The champagne flowed. The seeds were planted. Through the 1920s, Germany struggled. The Weimar Republic, the fragile democratic government that replaced the Kaiser's regime, lurched from crisis to crisis. In 1923, hyperinflation became so severe that people were carrying wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy bread. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by November 1923. People burned currency for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. Savings, the accumulated wealth of a lifetime, became worthless overnight. Middle-class families who had done everything right, saved carefully, lived responsibly, found themselves destitute. And then, just as Germany began to stabilize in the mid-1920s, with American loans propping up the economy, the Wall Street crash of 1929 hit. The loans were called in, and the entire structure collapsed again. Unemployment in Germany reached 30% by 1932. 6 million people out of work, breadlines, desperation. And into this desperation walked a man who had answers, or at least the appearance of answers. Adolf Hitler, the Austrian-born failed artist who had spent the 1920s in the political wilderness, preaching a gospel of racial supremacy, national humiliation, and Jewish conspiracy to anyone who would listen. For most of the decade, not many did. In the elections of 1928, his National Socialist German Workers' Party received just 2.6% of the vote. He was a fringe lunatic, a punchline, a man who would never amount to anything. By July 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the German Reichstag, with 37.4% of the vote. By January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. The transformation had taken less than 4 years. The Great Depression had done what years of political organizing could not. It had given the German people enough despair to vote for a monster. What happened next moved with a speed that still seems almost impossible in retrospect. Within months of taking power, Hitler dismantled German democracy with surgical efficiency. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the pretext for emergency powers. The Enabling Act in March gave Hitler the legal authority to rule by decree. Trade unions were abolished, opposition parties were banned, the press was brought to heel. By August 1934, after the death of President Hindenburg, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President and declared himself Führer, supreme leader. Germany had gone from a republic to a one-party dictatorship in 18 months. And the rest of Europe watched, expressed concern at dinner parties, and did nothing. This pattern of watching and doing nothing would define the next 6 years, and understanding it requires understanding the psychology of the men who sat in London and Paris in the 1930s. These were not stupid men. Many of them were intelligent, experienced, and genuinely well-intentioned. But they were men who had lived through the First World War, men who had watched a generation get fed into the machine of industrialized killing, men who had walked through Flanders fields and seen what modern warfare actually looked like up close. The trauma was immense and entirely real. The desire to avoid another such catastrophe was not cowardice, it was human. The problem was that this legitimate horror was weaponized by Hitler at every turn, and that the statesmen of Britain and France consistently chose to believe what they wanted to believe rather than what the evidence demanded. In March 1936, Hitler sent German troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone on the French border that the Versailles Treaty had specifically created to keep Germany from threatening France. It was a blatant, unambiguous violation of international law. Hitler's own generals were terrified. The German army was still weak. French and British military intervention at this point would almost certainly have ended the Nazi regime. Hitler himself later admitted, "The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs, for the military resources at our disposal would have been wholly inadequate for even a moderate resistance." France did not march. Britain counseled restraint. The world moved on. Hitler learned his lesson. The democracies were paralyzed by fear. They could be pushed. They would not push back. In March 1938, came the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. German troops rolled across the border. Crowds in Vienna cheered, though the crowds were carefully curated, and the large number of Austrians who were horrified were not shown on camera. The League of Nations convened. Strongly worded letters were drafted. Nothing happened. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation and became part of the Greater German Reich. Britain and France protested. Hitler ignored them. 6 months later, he wanted more. The Sudetenland crisis of autumn 1938 was the moment that should have been the line. The Sudetenland was the western edge of Czechoslovakia, home to roughly 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded it. Czechoslovakia, which had a functioning democracy, a real army, and strong defensive fortifications in the Sudetenland Mountains, refused. France had a treaty obligation to defend Czechoslovakia. Britain technically did not, but its prestige and its stated commitment to collective security were on the line. In late September 1938, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. What emerged was the Munich Agreement, arguably the most infamous diplomatic capitulation in the 20th century. Britain and France agreed to hand the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for his promise that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew back to London and stood outside 10 Downing Street, waving a piece of paper and delivering the words that would haunt him forever. "I believe it is peace for our time." The crowds cheered. People wept with relief. The nightmare of another war had been avoided. Or so they thought. Czechoslovakia, abandoned by its allies, surrendered the Sudetenland. It had no choice. With the defensive fortifications gone, the rest of the country was militarily indefensible. And the Czechs were right to understand what Munich really meant. On March 15, 1939, less than 6 months after Chamberlain's triumphant return, German tanks rolled into Prague. Hitler stood in Prague Castle and declared the rest of Czechoslovakia a German protectorate. In a single stroke, he had exposed the Munich Agreement as worthless, revealed his promises as lies, and demonstrated to anyone still paying attention that his ambitions were not limited to uniting ethnic Germans into one state. He wanted everything. This time, even the most committed appeasers in London and Paris could not explain it away. There was no ethnic German population in Bohemia and Moravia that needed protecting. This was naked, undisguised imperial conquest. The mood shifted dramatically. Chamberlain, personally humiliated by Hitler's betrayal, stood up in Parliament and declared that Britain would guarantee Poland's independence, that if Germany attacked Poland, Britain would go to war. France made the same commitment. It was a dramatic reversal of policy. It was also, as events would prove, a guarantee that Britain and France were not actually capable of honoring without Soviet help. And this is where the story takes its darkest and most fateful turn. Because by the spring of 1939, it was becoming clear to everyone, in London, in Paris, in Warsaw, and above all in Moscow, that whether there would be a war, and what kind of war it would be, depended almost entirely on what the Soviet Union decided to do. Stalin held the key. And Stalin knew it. The Soviet Union in 1939 was the largest country on Earth, with an army of over 1 million men. It shared a long border with Poland. If it allied with Britain and France, Germany would face the nightmare scenario of a two-front war, the same strategic trap that had strangled Germany in 1914 to 1918. Hitler would almost certainly back down. If Stalin stayed neutral, or worse, made a deal with Hitler, then Germany's eastern flank was secure, and the Wehrmacht could pour everything it had westward. The math was brutally simple. The entire balance of power in Europe rested on Stalin's choice. Through the summer of 1939, Britain and France sent delegations to Moscow to negotiate a potential alliance. The negotiations were, by any measure, a disaster. The British and French representatives were not the highest-ranking officials, a telling signal of how seriously London and Paris took the talks. They moved slowly, with elaborate caution, unwilling to make the kind of concrete military commitments that Stalin demanded. There were genuine complications. Poland, despite having just been guaranteed by Britain, flatly refused to allow Soviet troops onto Polish soil, even in the event of war with Germany. The Poles, with the bitter experience of centuries of Russian domination, would not accept Soviet protection. They feared, with considerable historical justification, that Soviet soldiers who marched into Poland to fight Germany might simply never leave. Stalin watched the Anglo-French negotiations with barely concealed contempt. And simultaneously, quietly, he was having a very different kind of conversation with Berlin. The signal had been sent in early May, when Stalin abruptly dismissed his foreign commissar, Maxim Litvinov, a Jewish diplomat who had spent years championing collective security against fascism, and replaced him with Vyacheslav Molotov, a loyal Stalin apparatchik with no particular ideological objections to Nazi Germany. In the coded language of 1930s diplomacy, this was a thunderclap. Anyone paying attention understood what it meant. In Berlin, they were paying very close attention indeed. What Stalin wanted from a deal with Hitler was straightforward, if monstrous. Territory. A buffer zone. Time. He had watched the purges of his own officer corps. He had ordered them. And he knew that the Red Army was not ready for a major war. He needed years to rebuild. If he could get Hitler to guarantee Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, he could sit back and watch Germany and the Western powers bleed each other white, while the USSR quietly prepared. It was cynical, it was cold-blooded, and it was, in its own terrible logic, entirely rational from the perspective of a man who viewed nations as instruments and human beings as variables in an equation. By August 1939, the talks in Moscow between the Soviets and the Anglo-French delegation had effectively collapsed, and in the last days of July, the real negotiations, the secret ones, the ones that mattered, were moving at extraordinary speed. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop sent urgent messages to Moscow. Stalin responded warmly. The machinery of catastrophe was in motion. And on the evening of August 22, 1939, Ribbentrop boarded a plane to Moscow. He was flying through the night toward a meeting that would set the world on fire. By the time he landed, everything was already decided. All that remained was the signing. The plane touched down at Moscow's Central Aerodrome at noon on August 23, 1939. Ribbentrop stepped onto the tarmac into the flat, gray light of a Russian summer afternoon and was met by Soviet officials with a correctness that bordered on warmth. Remarkable, given that less than a decade earlier, the two ideologies represented by the men on that tarmac had been screaming at each other across Europe about who would be the first to destroy the other. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had spent the 1930s as declared existential enemies. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that the Soviet Union was Germany's natural target for conquest, a vast Slavic wasteland to be cleared and settled by the master race. Soviet propaganda had identified fascism as capitalism's death rattle, the final convulsion of a doomed system. And yet here was Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, stepping onto Soviet soil, and here were Stalin's men smiling at him. Ideology, it turned out, was flexible when territory was on offer. The meeting that followed has a quality almost of theater. Dark theater, the kind where the audience knows what's coming and can only watch in horror. Stalin and Molotov received Ribbentrop in the Kremlin. The atmosphere was businesslike, even jovial. Stalin, who had spent years purging anyone he suspected of disloyalty, who had sent millions to the gulags and tens of thousands to firing squads, was in an excellent mood. He had every reason to be. He was about to get everything he wanted without firing a single shot. Ribbentrop represented a Germany that was desperate. Desperate enough to offer Stalin prizes that no one else was offering. Britain and France were asking Stalin to risk war with Germany. Hitler was offering to split the continent with him. The negotiations took hours, but the outline had already been agreed in advance through back channels. What was being settled now were the details. The precise lines on the map, the exact wording, the legal architecture that would make the arrangement look, at least on its public face, like a routine non-aggression pact between two neighboring powers. The public treaty was simple enough. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed not to attack each other and to remain neutral if either was attacked by a third party. On its face, this was merely a diplomatic arrangement, not fundamentally different from the many non-aggression pacts that European powers had signed throughout the 1930s. Ribbentrop could go home, and Hitler could announce it to the world as a triumph of German diplomacy. And, technically, every word of the public announcement would be true. But there was another document. A secret protocol, initialed and signed the same night, that divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union into explicit spheres of influence. The language was bureaucratic, the phrasing carefully neutral, the word sphere of influence doing enormous work to obscure the raw ugliness of what was actually being decided. In the Soviet sphere, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the eastern portion of Poland east of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San. In the German sphere, Western Poland and initially Lithuania, though a supplementary protocol signed less than a month later would swap Lithuania into the Soviet sphere in exchange for a larger slice of Poland for Germany. Bessarabia, the contested territory between Romania and the USSR, was assigned to the Soviet sphere, with Germany declaring its complete political disinterestedness in the region. Diplomatic language for, "It's yours, do what you like." Read these clauses carefully, and what you are reading is the following. Two men, in a room in Moscow, have just decided, without the knowledge or consent of the people living in these places, that Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and half of Poland now belong to Stalin. Not in any formal legal sense. The protocol is secret, its existence deniable, but in the only sense that ultimately matters, the sense of raw power. Stalin will move into these territories when he chooses, and Germany will not object. In exchange, Germany gets the western half of Poland, and, crucially, it gets the certainty that when it invades, the Soviet Union will not come to Poland's aid. It will come to Germany's aid by stabbing Poland in the back from the east. The signing took place late that night. After the documents were initialed, Stalin proposed a toast. According to Ribbentrop's account of the evening, Stalin raised his glass and said, with what must have been extraordinary self-satisfaction, that he knew how much the German people loved their Führer and wished to drink to his health. It was the kind of moment that belongs in a novel about the collapse of civilization. The Soviet dictator, who had murdered more of his own citizens than Hitler had yet killed of anyone, toasting the health of the man who had promised in print to enslave or exterminate the Slavic peoples. And yet, the logic was clean if you were willing to follow it to its conclusion without flinching. Both men understood that they were playing a game in which ordinary human beings were not players, but pieces, and pieces do not get a vote. News of the public pact, not the secret protocol which would remain hidden, But the bare fact that Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression agreement detonated across Europe's capitals like a bomb. In London and Paris, the reaction was somewhere between shock and despair. The entire Anglo-French strategic calculation had rested on the assumption that if they guaranteed Poland, Germany would face the prospect of a two-front war with the Soviet Union on the eastern side and would back down, just as it had backed down every time before. That calculation was now void. Germany's eastern flank was not just secure, it had an active partner. In Warsaw, the Polish government received the news with a kind of stunned, hollow calm. Polish Foreign Minister Józef Beck had been warned that something was happening in Moscow, but had not grasped the scale of it. He was famously surrounded, according to some accounts, by Soviet agents of influence who had kept him from understanding how completely his country had been abandoned. He would later say, from his internment in Romania, that the alternative to fighting, accepting Hitler's demands about Danzig and the Polish corridor, would have made Poland a German vassal state, its army subordinated to the Wehrmacht for a campaign against the Soviet Union. Poland had chosen to fight. It would pay a price that staggers comprehension. In Berlin, Hitler was almost giddy. He had been told immediately when the pact was signed, had reportedly slapped his thigh and exclaimed, "I have them!" Them meaning the Western powers, who had just had their entire deterrence strategy destroyed in a single night. He told his generals, in a speech delivered just days before the invasion, "Now Poland is in the position in which I wanted her. I am only afraid that at the last moment some swine or other will yet submit to me a plan for mediation." He need not have worried. The mediation that Mussolini briefly floated went nowhere. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, some accounts say the first German shells actually landed at 4:15, before the formal order, the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border. The Second World War had begun. The invasion of Poland was the first real-world demonstration of what the German military called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was not actually a formal doctrine with that name. The term was largely coined by journalists watching what happened. But what it described was real enough. The concentrated use of armor and air power, moving fast, striking deep, bypassing strong points and encircling entire armies before they could react. Supported by Stuka dive bombers whose distinctive wailing sirens were deliberately designed to terrorize. The psychological dimension was part of the strategy. The point was not just to defeat the Polish army, but to shatter its will, to create chaos and panic so complete that organized resistance became impossible. Poland's military was not contemptible. The Polish army was large, over 1 million men mobilized, and its soldiers fought with ferocity and courage that won the respect even of German commanders. The cavalry charges that feature in some accounts of the Polish campaign have been somewhat mythologized. Polish cavalry did not generally charge tanks with sabers, though individual tragic incidents did occur. But the structural reality was brutal. Poland was fighting the most modern army in Europe, with equipment and tactics that, in some respects, still reflected the previous war. Its air force, though it fought hard, was outnumbered and outclassed. Its tank forces were fragmented rather than concentrated. Its defensive lines were hundreds of miles long, spread thin, and had to cover both the western border with Germany and the long northern border where German forces swept down from East Prussia as well. And then, on September 17th, 16 days after the German invasion began, while Polish forces were still fighting desperately on multiple fronts, the eastern border opened up. Soviet forces crossed into Poland from the east, pursuant to the secret protocol that the Poles knew nothing about. The official Soviet justification was almost insultingly transparent. A note handed to the Polish ambassador in Moscow claimed that, since the Polish state had ceased to exist, the Soviet Union was obliged to take under its protection the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations living in eastern Poland. The Polish ambassador reportedly threw the note back at the Soviet diplomat who delivered it. It made no difference. The Red Army poured across the border along a front hundreds of miles wide. Poland was now fighting Germany in the west and north, Germany and Slovak forces in the south, and the Soviet Union in the east. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, honoring their guarantee, at least technically, but they were providing no meaningful military assistance. A French military advance into the Saar region in early September was cautious, limited, and quickly halted. The Allied command had already privately concluded, within days of the German invasion, that they could not effectively help Poland and that they would focus on their own preparations. This decision was confirmed at a conference of French and British commanders at Abbeville on September 12th. Poland had been guaranteed. Poland was fighting. Poland was being abandoned. Warsaw, under bombardment from the air and surrounded by German forces, held out with extraordinary tenacity. The civilian population dug anti-tank ditches, helped fortify barricades, and refused to surrender even as the city was systematically reduced to rubble. The siege of Warsaw lasted until September 27th. The formal surrender of the last organized Polish military forces came on October 6th. In 5 weeks, a nation of 35 million people had been erased from the map. Divided between Germany and the Soviet Union along the lines agreed in Moscow in a single night by two men who had never visited Poland and regarded its people as obstacles to be removed. What followed in the occupied territories was not administration, it was annihilation. In the German zone, the Nazi racial ideology that had been incubating since 1933 was now applied with industrial thoroughness. Poland's Jews, roughly 3 million people, the largest Jewish population in Europe, were immediately subject to persecution, forced labor, ghettoization. The mechanisms that would eventually become the Holocaust were being assembled in real time. Poland's intellectual class, its priests, its nobility, its military officers, the Nazis had prepared lists, and the killing started immediately. The German occupiers were not suppressing a population. They were trying to eliminate a civilization. In the Soviet zone, the methods were different, but the outcome was comparable in its horror. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, moved in behind the Red Army and began systematic arrests of anyone who might represent a threat. Military officers, police, landowners, intellectuals, anyone with education or authority. Somewhere between 320,000 and 1 million Polish citizens were deported to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia in a series of mass deportations through 1940 and 1941. Tens of thousands simply disappeared. The most notorious single crime of this period, though it would remain officially denied for 50 years, was the Katyn massacre. The execution by NKVD officers on Stalin's direct written order of approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in the forests of Katyn and several other sites in spring 1940. They were shot in the back of the head, one by one, and buried in mass graves. When the graves were discovered by the Germans in 1943, the Soviet Union denied all responsibility and blamed the Nazis. This lie was maintained as official Soviet policy until 1990. The fate of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, played out more slowly but with equal inevitability. The secret protocol had assigned them to the Soviet sphere, and Stalin collected them methodically. In the autumn of 1939, he demanded that each country sign agreements allowing Soviet military bases on their soil. Faced with the alternative of immediate invasion, they signed. Then, in June 1940, while the world's attention was consumed by the German conquest of France, Soviet forces occupied all three countries simultaneously. Show elections were organized, with single-candidate ballots, and the resulting parliaments unanimously voted to request admission to the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania disappeared as independent nations. Mass deportations of their populations to Siberia followed. The Baltic peoples would not recover their independence for half a century. Finland tried to resist. Unlike the Baltic states, it refused to sign agreements ceding territory and bases to the Soviet Union. Stalin, apparently confident that Finland would collapse as quickly as Poland, invaded on November 30th, 1939. What followed was one of the most remarkable military upsets of the entire war. The Finnish army, vastly outnumbered, fought the Red Army to a standstill in the frozen forests and lakes of the Karelian Isthmus. Soviet forces, disorganized and poorly led, the officer corps had been devastated by Stalin's purges, suffered catastrophic casualties. The world watched in astonishment as tiny Finland, with a population of less than 4 million, held off the Soviet colossus for 3.5 months. The League of Nations, in one of its final significant acts, expelled the Soviet Union for the invasion. It was a gesture that changed nothing on the ground. Eventually, Soviet forces, reorganized and reinforced, overwhelmed Finnish defenses in March 1940. Finland ceded the demanded territories, but kept its independence, the only country assigned to Stalin's sphere in the secret protocol that managed to survive as a sovereign nation. All of this, every deportation, every execution, every bombed city and burning village, traced back to that single night in Moscow. The secret protocol was the blueprint. The map drawn by two men in a Kremlin conference room was being colored in with blood, one country at a time. And the document that had made it all possible was being kept in a vault, its existence denied, its contents unknown to the millions of people whose lives it had determined. Stalin had what he wanted: a buffer zone, time, and the comfort of watching Germany and the Western powers begin the bloody process of destroying each other. For almost 2 years, the calculation seemed to be working. And then, on June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, 3.5 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And Stalin discovered, with catastrophic suddenness, exactly what his agreement with Hitler had really been worth. The man who had spent the 1930s calculating every move with cold-blooded precision, who had purged his own generals and signed away entire nations without losing a night's sleep, who had reportedly dismissed British and American warnings of the coming German attack as provocation and disinformation. That man sat in his dacha outside Moscow in the first hours of June 22, 1941, and did not speak. Aides who were present in those early hours described a Stalin who was visibly shaken in a way no one had ever seen before. Not angry, not decisive, shaken. The phone lines were lighting up from the western military districts with reports that made no sense in the framework of the world Stalin had constructed for himself. German bombers over Kiev, German tanks across the Bug River, German paratroopers dropping behind Soviet lines. The Wehrmacht, the same army that Stalin had watched conquer France in 6 weeks, was now coming for him. And in those first terrible hours, the man who had signed the secret protocol, who had cleared Hitler's path to Poland, who had swallowed the Baltic states whole, who had convinced himself he was the cleverest player at the table, had no coherent response. He had been played. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was at that point the largest military operation in human history. 3 army groups, comprising roughly 3.8 million Axis troops, attacked simultaneously along a front of nearly 2,000 miles. The Luftwaffe destroyed an enormous portion of the Soviet Air Force in the first hours. Many planes were caught on the ground, lined up in neat rows, because Stalin had refused to authorize dispersal on the grounds that it might provoke Germany. Soviet border units, poorly positioned and under orders that reflected Stalin's insistence that no attack was coming, were overwhelmed before they could mount coherent resistance. In the first week, the Germans advanced hundreds of miles. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. The encirclement at Kiev in September 1941 resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest single encirclement in military history. By December 1941, German forces had advanced to within sight of Moscow's suburbs. The Soviet Union had lost, in dead, wounded, captured, and missing, somewhere in the region of 4 million soldiers. In 6 months. What Stalin had bought with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was, in the end, almost exactly nothing. The time to prepare that he had supposedly purchased turned out to be time he had largely wasted, or actively used to make the Soviet military weaker through purges. The buffer zone of Eastern Europe that the secret protocol had handed him was overrun in days. The agreement with Hitler had not delayed the German attack. It had arguably made it more likely by convincing Hitler that his eastern flank was secure enough to allow him to concentrate everything against France first, then turn east with his full strength intact. The cynical calculation had been catastrophically wrong, and the price for that miscalculation would be paid not by Stalin, who survived, who ultimately triumphed, who died in his own bed in 1953 still in power, but by the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in what Russians still call the Great Patriotic War. But none of that is the most remarkable part of what follows. The most remarkable part is what happened to the document itself. The secret protocol. That single sheet of paper that had divided a continent and set in motion a chain of events that killed tens of millions of people. What happened to it? Where did it go? And why did it take 50 years for the world to officially acknowledge its existence? The original German copy of the secret protocol was captured by American forces at the end of the war, along with enormous quantities of Nazi foreign ministry documents. The Americans microfilmed everything, and the secret protocol, both the original and supplementary versions, was there in the archive, clearly legible, unambiguous. By the late 1940s, Western historians and governments were aware of the document's existence. It was referenced at the Nuremberg trials. In fact, the German defense team at Nuremberg attempted to introduce the secret protocol as evidence, the argument being that if Germany was being tried for aggressive war and the partition of Poland, then the Soviet Union, which had participated in that partition under the terms of the secret protocol, should be in the dock alongside Germany. The Soviet judges and prosecutors at Nuremberg moved aggressively to block this line of argument. The secret protocol was ruled inadmissible. The subject was dropped. One of the 4 powers sitting in judgment at Nuremberg was itself a signatory to a secret agreement that had directly enabled the war being tried. This fact was officially inconvenient and was therefore officially ignored. The Soviet copy of the secret protocol had meanwhile disappeared. Or rather, as would eventually become clear, it had been filed in the most restricted section of the Soviet archives, accessible only to the highest levels of the Politburo, under a classification so secret that most Soviet officials did not know it existed. The official Soviet position, maintained with absolute consistency from 1939 through the 1980s, was simple. The secret protocol did not exist. It had never existed. The documents circulating in the West were Nazi forgeries, fabricated to slander the Soviet Union and drive a wedge between the USSR and the fraternal socialist peoples of Eastern Europe. This was the line. It was taught in Soviet schools. It was repeated by Soviet diplomats at international conferences. It was asserted by Soviet historians in scholarly publications. For 50 years, the official history of the Soviet Union contained a lie so large and so consequential that it shaped the political identity of 3 entire nations: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been incorporated into the USSR on the basis of voluntary accession that was, in reality, the direct implementation of a document whose existence Moscow was simultaneously denying. The Baltic peoples knew the truth. They had always known it, or at least suspected it. The pattern of what had happened to them, the ultimatums, the bases, the occupation, the show elections, the deportations, matched so precisely with what would have been required by a prior secret agreement that the conclusion was almost inescapable. Baltic émigré communities in the West had been arguing for decades that a secret protocol must exist. Western historians largely agreed. But without the Soviet original, without Moscow's own copy of the document, the case could always be dismissed, in the Soviet telling, as anti-Soviet propaganda based on Nazi forgeries. The denial was sustainable precisely because the proof was locked in a vault in Moscow. Throughout the Cold War, the question of the secret protocol remained a live and genuinely explosive political issue, particularly in the Baltic states. Baltic independence movements consistently pointed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as proof that their incorporation into the Soviet Union was illegal under international law, that it had been achieved not through any genuine exercise of self-determination, but through a secret criminal agreement between 2 totalitarian powers. The Soviet response was always the same. The protocol is a fabrication. The accession of the Baltic states was voluntary and legitimate. There is nothing to discuss. The conversation was closed by assertion and, when necessary, by force. In 1949, a second massive wave of deportations from the Baltic states, targeting roughly 90,000 people, was carried out in part to suppress precisely this kind of historical memory and political resistance. The situation began to crack in the late 1980s in the extraordinary political atmosphere created by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 with a genuine belief that the Soviet Union needed fundamental reform, and that reform required a more honest relationship with the country's own history. The rehabilitation of victims of Stalinist terror, the acknowledgement of crimes that had been officially denied for decades, the opening of previously sealed archives, these were politically revolutionary acts in the Soviet context, and they created space for questions that had been forbidden to be asked openly. And in the Baltic states, the question being asked most urgently was, does the secret protocol exist? In 1988, the Baltic independence movements, which were growing rapidly in the new political atmosphere, began organizing mass demonstrations around the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the signing, approximately 2 million people formed a human chain stretching 675 kilometers through all 3 Baltic states, from Tallinn in Estonia, through Riga in Latvia, to Vilnius in Lithuania. They held hands in an unbroken line and sang. It was called the Baltic Way, and it was one of the most extraordinary acts of collective political expression of the 20th century. Its message was unambiguous. We know what was done to us, we know why, and we want the truth acknowledged and our freedom restored. The political pressure was now impossible to ignore. In the same month, August 1989, the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR established a commission to investigate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, headed by Alexander Yakovlev, one of the key architects of Gorbachev's reforms. The commission's conclusion, presented in December 1989, was unequivocal. The secret protocol existed. It had been signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop. It was authentic, and it was juridically untenable and invalid from the moment of signing. The Congress of People's Deputies passed a resolution acknowledging and condemning the secret protocols. It was, in the dry language of official resolutions, a moment of genuine historical consequence. The Soviet Union was officially admitting, after 50 years of denial, that it had secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe with Nazi Germany and had been lying about it ever since. The Soviet original of the secret protocol was subsequently located in the Presidential Archive, the most restricted Soviet archive, directly under the control of the head of state. It had been there all along. Physically present in Moscow throughout all 50 years of official denial, filed away in a folder, classified beyond access, while Soviet diplomats stood at international podiums and called the document a Nazi forgery. The copy was eventually shown to the public. It was exactly what the German copy and the American microfilms had always shown it to be. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. It was a map of Eastern Europe with a line drawn down the middle of Poland and a set of clauses assigning nations to spheres of influence. Written in plain language, signed and initialed, authentic and damning. The consequences of this official acknowledgement moved quickly. The Baltic independence movements, which had been building throughout 1989 and into 1990, now had the legal and moral foundation they needed. If the secret protocol was illegal and invalid from the moment of signing, then the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union, which had been implemented directly as a result of that protocol, was also illegal and invalid. The Soviet Union had, in acknowledging the protocol, effectively conceded the legal basis of Baltic claims to independence. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all declared restored independence in 1990, and the international community, first Iceland, then the Scandinavian countries, then others, began recognizing them. The Soviet Union initially resisted, tried negotiation, attempted economic pressure, and in January 1991 resorted briefly to military force when Soviet troops seized buildings in Vilnius and Riga, killing civilians. But the tide could not be held back. When the Soviet Union itself collapsed in December 1991, the Baltic states were already gone, and the secret protocol, that document signed in a single night by two men who thought they were the masters of the world, had played a significant role in unraveling the empire that one of those men had built. The reckoning with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not end with Soviet acknowledgement. Its shadow extended further than the Baltic states, further than the question of Soviet culpability for the Second World War's beginning, further than any single political consequence. It raised, and continues to raise, fundamental questions about the nature of historical memory, the relationship between states and the truths they choose to suppress, and the way in which official lies, maintained long enough and forcefully enough, reshape not just the historical record, but the lived reality of millions of people. Consider what the 50-year denial actually meant in human terms. 3 generations of Baltic citizens grew up in a state that told them their countries had voluntarily joined the Soviet Union. Children were taught this in school. It was in the textbooks. Teachers who knew better, and many did, taught it anyway, because the alternative was the Gulag, or worse. Families that had been deported to Siberia, that had lost fathers and mothers and grandparents to the machinery set in motion by the secret protocol, were told that what had happened to them was a necessary measure of socialist construction, that there was no secret agreement, that the Western accounts of what had occurred were imperialist fabrications. The lie was not merely a diplomatic convenience. It was the foundational narrative of 3 nations' existence within the Soviet state. To demolish it was to demolish the legitimacy of 50 years of Soviet rule over those nations. Which is exactly what happened. Which is exactly why it was maintained so long and so fiercely. Poland, too, lived under the shadow of the secret protocol in ways that went beyond the obvious. The Katyn massacre, 22,000 officers and intellectuals shot on Stalin's orders in the forests near Smolensk, was officially blamed on Nazi Germany for over 40 years. Soviet authorities fabricated evidence, intimidated witnesses, and punished those who raised doubts. Polish citizens who asked questions about what had happened to their fathers and grandfathers were told that the Germans had killed them in 1941. Families built their grief around a lie. The truth was acknowledged by the Soviet Union only in 1990, and the full documentation, including Stalin's original signed order for the executions, was released by Russia only in 1992. As with the secret protocol, the proof had been in Moscow all along, in a folder in an archive, waiting for a moment of political change sufficient to bring it into the light. What emerges from this history, the pact, the protocol, the invasion, the denial, the final acknowledgement, is something more disturbing than a simple story of villainy and its punishment. The villains, in the conventional sense, were never really punished. Hitler died in his bunker in April 1945, escaping the reckoning that Nuremberg administered to his subordinates. Stalin died in his bed in 1953, still in power, having presided over the deaths of millions and the enslavement of nations. Having survived the catastrophe his own miscalculation had brought down on the Soviet Union, having won the war that the pact had helped to start. Molotov, who signed the document, who gave it his name, who maintained the denial through decades of interrogation by foreign journalists and diplomats who knew perfectly well what he had done. Molotov died in 1986, at the age of 96, outliving the Soviet Union he had served and never, in any public forum, expressing remorse. Ribbentrop was hanged at Nuremberg in 1946, but he had been, in the end, an instrument. The man who flew to Moscow, who negotiated the final details, who carried the pen. The architects of the catastrophe mostly escaped its direct consequences. What did not escape was Europe itself. The continent that had, in 1939, stumbled into a war that would kill between 70 and 85 million people, emerged from that war physically devastated, politically transformed, and psychologically marked in ways that shaped everything that followed. The Iron Curtain that divided Europe for 4 decades drew its line, in part, along the boundaries set by the secret protocol. The countries assigned to the Soviet sphere in that document remained Soviet satellites until 1989 and 1991. The Cold War, in other words, was, in some meaningful sense, the long geopolitical aftermath of a document signed in a single night in Moscow. The nuclear standoff between the superpowers, the division of Germany, the Berlin Wall, the proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and Angola, all of these things had roots that ran back through the rubble of the Second World War to the specific decisions made in the 1930s, decisions shaped by Versailles, by appeasement, by economic collapse, by the rise of fascism, and by the particular calculation that 2 particular men made in August 1939, when they decided that their mutual interest in conquest outweighed the ideological hatred that supposedly divided them. The lesson, if there is one lesson broad enough to contain everything this history carries, is perhaps something about the cost of chosen ignorance, the cost of what happens when governments, populations, and international institutions collectively decide to not see what is in front of them. The Western powers chose not to see what Hitler was in the 1930s, or chose to see it and believe they could manage it, until the management failed catastrophically. The Soviet Union chose not to see, or rather chose to deny, what the secret protocol meant for 50 years, and maintained that denial at the cost of the political freedom of 3 entire nations. The German people, in their millions, chose not to examine too closely the methods by which their economic misery was being resolved. Every major catastrophe in this history was preceded by a period of aggressive, sustained, collectively maintained not knowing. The truth was almost always available to anyone who genuinely wanted to find it. The question was always whether people wanted to find it badly enough. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret protocol did not cause the Second World War in isolation. The war had many fathers: Versailles, the Depression, appeasement, the structural weaknesses of the interwar international order, the specific characters of Hitler and Stalin, and the ideological systems they represented. But the pact was the trigger. The mechanism that converted a tense standoff into an active conflict. The agreement that told Hitler his eastern flank was safe, that persuaded him the democracies would back down, as they had always backed down. That removed the last theoretical obstacle between his ambitions and their execution. Without that agreement, the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939 does not happen. Not on that date, probably not in that form. The 50 years of Soviet denial were, in this sense, an acknowledgement in reverse. You only maintain a lie that fiercely about something that mattered that much. The Soviet Union lied about the secret protocol for half a century precisely because the truth of it was so explosive, so damning, so fundamentally incompatible with the Soviet Union's self-image as an anti-fascist state and a force for liberation. The document sat in its vault in Moscow, classified and silent, while the world it had helped to create played out its bloody course around it. 2 men, 1 night, 1 signature. 50 million dead, and 50 years of silence.